We're continuing on with our sermon series today called Rescue, and what our sermon series is dealing with is it's dealing with sin. And the reason that we're dealing with sin is because we've been talking this year, and we'll continue to talk throughout the year, about how we become a people that is more full of worship and more full of joy, and really experiences the life that God has intended for us. And looking at the Bible is fairly clear on what it is that keeps us from being that kind of people, and that is sin. And so we want to understand, well, how do we deal with sin? And so the passage that we've been dealing with for the whole sermon series is Genesis chapter 3. And we've talked about two different aspects of this so far. We've talked about the fact that first there's a question. And remember, we talked about how this question is initially Satan's question, but as soon as he gives it utterance and we hear it, it becomes our question. And that is, did God actually say, "You shall not eat of any tree in the garden"? And remember, we talked about this idea that's really important, is that the question is not necessarily a bad thing in itself. In fact, it can lead to some very good outcomes. All the question really is, it's a mark of our lack of infinite, right? Because God is an infinite being, and we are finite, and so our finiteness means that we don't have all the answers. We don't have at our fingertips every piece of information. And so that creates in us questions. Now, the problem is that we talked last week about this idea of doubt. And doubt means that when we get the answer to the question, we either get the answer from the wrong place, or even if we get it from the right place, we're skeptical. You see, the problem is when God answers the questions, we're often skeptical of the answer. But when Satan answers the question for us, we're often very accepting of that answer. That doubt is a problem. But after that doubt, then there's a problem that then becomes really big in our lives. We see in verse 4 of chapter 3 of Genesis that it says, "The serpent said to the woman, 'You will not surely die. God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be open, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil.'" So Satan here gives the answer to the question, and Adam and Eve believe it. There's the doubt, doubting God. But then in verse 6 it says, "When the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was delight to the eyes, it was desired to make one wise. She took of its fruit and ate, and she gave also some to her husband." So what happens is that first there's the question, and then there's doubt, and then there's vision. And so we want to talk today about the problem of vision. And this problem of vision is found throughout the Bible, but there's one story that's very good at encapsulating this problem, and that's found in 2 Kings chapter 6. Now, in 2 Kings chapter 6, you have a situation where there's a kingdom in the north and there's a kingdom of the south. Remember that the people of God, the Israelites, were separated after Solomon into a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom. And this northern kingdom has all bad kings, and it's all kind of downhill. And so there's prophets that God sends to them to bring them back to Him. And one of these prophets named Elisha. Now, here's the interesting thing. Even though the northern kingdom is all full of all kinds of evil, and they have a lot of evil kings, God's still looking out for them. And so this people called the Syrians, they're coming against them and kind of messing around and raiding their towns and doing all this kind of stuff. The problem is the Syrians, what they're finding is that somehow the Israelites are always ready for them. And so the Syrian king goes into his war council and says, "Which one of you is giving up all of our plans?" And one guy there goes, "Hey, it's not any of us. It's that prophet of God. He always knows what's going on. Before you even do something, he knows. It's like he's a fly on the wall. You got to take care of that prophet. Get rid of that prophet." And so really, the Syrian king says, "Oh, well, that's believable." And it's interesting that he's smart enough to understand that the prophet of God would know all this stuff. You know, he's not so completely gone that he doubts that this is possible. And so he sends an army after the prophet of God, after Elisha. And so they go and they surround the city where Elisha is, and they're going to come in and they're going to get Elisha. And in 2 Kings chapter 6, verse 15, it says, when the servant of the man of God rose early in the morning and went out, behold, an army with horses and chariots was all around the city. And the servant said, alas, my master, what shall we do? So Elisha's servant gets up in the morning, and all of a sudden he sees, we're surrounded. And so Elisha in verse 16 says, do not be afraid, for those who are with us are more than those who are with them. Then Elisha prayed and said, O Lord, please open his eyes that he may see. So the Lord opened the eyes of the young man, and he saw, and behold, the mountain was full of horses and chariots of fire all around Elisha. And when the Syrians came down against him, Elisha prayed to the Lord and said, please strike this people with blindness. So he struck them with blindness in accordance with the prayer of Elisha. And Elisha said to them, this is not the way, and this is not the city. Follow me, and I will bring you to the man whom you seek. And he led them to Samaria. So basically what Elisha does is he prays that his servant will have his eyes open, and all of a sudden he sees all around these fiery chariots. And then he prays that the people that have come against them will have blindness. Now, most commentators and theologians will say that this blindness wasn't actually like they couldn't see anything, because if they did that, then they would have given up their plan right away. But instead, it was like they couldn't. They were a part of a delusion. They couldn't really see clearly or understand clearly what was happening. And so what Elisha does is he leads them to Samaria. Now, that might not mean much to you, but Samaria is the capital city of the northern kingdom. So basically, he leads them right into the stronghold of the Israelites to where they're surrounded. And by the time their eyes are open, they realize, we're in the middle of a stronghold, a fortress. We're surrounded. And so at that point, they have to give up. Now, it's important to understand that what this passage is talking about is not something that we should see as remarkable. That there is a problem of vision that exists from the beginning of the Bible to the end of the Bible, and that we ourselves experience the problem of vision. And so we're going to look at three different aspects of that today. We're going to look at, first of all, the problem of vision. We're going to look at the cure of vision. And then we're going to look at the effect of vision. And so let's start here by looking at the problem of vision. Now, I know you guys remember the movie The Sixth Sense. And there's going to be spoilers here. It's interesting that M. Night Shyamalan, he has these two movies, The Sixth Sense and Signs, and both of them deal with something very similar. They deal with this issue of vision. How many of you guys have seen these movies, The Sixth Sense and Signs? The Sixth Sense is interesting because there's a kid in the story who says something fascinating. He says, people only see what they want to see. And he's not just talking about people who are alive, he's talking about people who are dead, that these people only see the things that they want to see. And then later on in the movie Signs, what the director does is he has this character give a speech in the middle of the movie. And if you've seen the movie, what happens is there's an alien invasion going on. And he says to the main character says to his brother, you got to ask yourself, what kind of picture or what kind of person are you? Do you see these things happening in the world, and do they mean something, or are they just random events? And that's important because at one point in the movie, the brother has to determine what kind of person is he. And the main character as well. They're standing there and they're in this position where they've got aliens that are in their house, and it's threatening the life of the main character's son, and he's lost his wife, the main character's lost his wife, and he can't bear to lose somebody else, and he's got to make this determination, what will I do in this moment? And so he tells his brother, swing away, and that's a reference to this idea that all through the movie, there's been these signs about really what's going on and how to deal with the problem of these aliens, and that there's some kind of intelligence, some kind of force, some kind of God that's been putting all of these events together, and these events have greater meaning than they appear to have on the surface. And at that point, the main character has accepted that. And so he tells his brother to swing away at the water glasses that the main character's little daughter has left around the house. And so as he hits these water glasses, the water then sprays onto the alien. And what they discover in this moment is that these aliens, they can't take water on their skin. It starts to burn like acid. Now, I tell you that because really, throughout the Bible presents life in a similar way. That there's much more going on than we see. In fact, our vision is very obscured. And the physical reality is that this is true. I want you guys to do an experiment with me. You're all going to look dumb, but we're going to look dumb together, okay? So take your hands, make 2 thumbs up, put them out as far as you can. Close your left eye. Close your left eye and look at your left thumb. Now focus on that left thumb, and I want you to slowly move your right thumb to your right. Now, if you do this right and you go really slow, you'll hit the spot at which your right thumb will disappear. You have to do it very slow, and you have to really focus on that left thumb. Now, you can do it the opposite way if you want to with that eye, but you can reach a point and you can stop right where your thumb will be completely gone. Now, it might not work for you right now, but try it at home. I promise you this works. Now, why does it work? Because in the middle of your eye, you have a thing called the optic disc. And the optic disc is where your optic nerve actually attaches to the back of your eye. And you have no rods or cones in that small little area where your optic disc is, where that nerve connects to your eye. And so what that means practically is you actually have a hole in your vision. You have a spot in the middle of your vision that you cannot see anything. Now, here's the interesting thing. You have 2 eyes, and so these spots kind of cancel each other out. But do something interesting here. Close one eye. Do you have in the middle of your vision a blank spot? You shouldn't. So how is that possible? Well, scientists don't exactly know. They know that you have this hole in your vision. They don't know why you don't perceive it. But the leading theory is that your brain actually fills in the information it thinks should be there. You're delusional. You're delusional. Your brain actually fills in what it thinks should be there, and it's actually good enough at it that you don't even notice the fact that you've got a big blind spot in your vision. It's a really weird thing. They don't know exactly how it works. But here's the interesting thing. Spiritually, it's kind of the same deal. Spiritually speaking, we have a big blind spot in our vision, and we have a tendency to fill in what we want to be there. Adam and Eve, when they're dealing with the serpent in the garden, they have a question, and that question leads to doubt. And then when they look at the tree through the lens of that doubt, they see what they want to see. Notice what it said when we read it. It says, "So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food and that it was a delight to the eyes and that it would cause the fall of man and death, she decided to eat some." No, that's not what it says. It says she saw that the tree was good for food and that it was a delight to the eyes, and that it was desirable to make one wise. You see, she only saw a part of the picture. You see, all that I'm sure was true. God makes things good. I'm sure that it was pleasing to the eye. God makes things good. I'm sure that it was tasty. God makes things good. And it was desirable to make one wise. But here's the thing. It was also something that God had commanded them not to do. And so God had said, if you eat from this, it's death. So spiritually, now physically it looks good, but spiritually it's death. And so there's a choice to make when you look at this tree, and the choice is, well, am I going to see this through the physical lens, or am I going to see this through the spiritual lens? And they choose what they want to see. The servant of Elisha is in the same place. He looks out, and what he sees is he sees that they're surrounded. Now here's the thing. You might ask yourself, well, who would want to see that? But the reality of the situation is that when you become spiritually blind, you will see what's inside of you. You don't see what's really out there. You see what's inside of you. You see, your brain fills in what it wants. Spiritually, your brain fills in what it wants. Have you ever experienced somebody saying, well, you know what? I'm going to make this decision, and it'll be okay. And you're hearing them, they're talking to you. Maybe they're a good friend of yours, they're coming to you and they're wanting advice, or they're wanting to tell you what they're going to do. And they say, you know what, I'm going to do the X, Y, and Z. And I know people will say that's probably not a good idea, but I think it'll be okay. And you're saying to yourself, why in the world would you believe that? Why would you think that this is going to be okay? Why would you think that there's not going to be any repercussions from this? Why would you think that this is going to work out? Well, because what's inside of you is what you see. In fact, what spiritual blindness does is it makes life, it makes your vision only able to see yourself. No matter what you go, no matter what you look at, what you will see is yourself. If you become spiritually blind, you will be able to see nothing outside of yourself. What does that mean? It means that whatever's inside of you, that's what you'll see everywhere. Have you ever known somebody that's full of fear? What happens? Whenever they look at anything, what do they see? They're afraid. You see, what's inside of them is fear, and because they don't have spiritual vision, no matter where they look, all they see are things to be afraid of. It can be something incredibly simple. It can be something incredibly benign. It can be something that's even something that should be enjoyable, something that should be fun. And they won't see enjoyment. They won't see fun. All they'll see is what's inside of them. They'll see fear. You see, what happens in our physical blind spot is it gets filled in with not what's out there, but what's in here. And what happens with our spiritual blind spot is the same thing. The world will not appear to you the way it actually is. What will happen is you'll only see what's inside of you being projected out into the world. And so if you're full of confidence, you're going to look out and see nothing but opportunities. You're going to see nothing but what it can give to you. Some people will call that pride. You'll look at something that's really difficult, something that somebody says, hey, maybe you should stay away from that, maybe you should be cautious, and you'll say, nope, I got it under control. How many wars have been lost? Because the people who start the wars look out and don't see reality. They only see their own pride, their own hubris. You see, it doesn't really matter what's inside of you to this extent. You won't be seeing the real world. So if you're full of fear, you'll see a world full of fear. If you're full of pride, you'll think you can handle everything. You'll go off in ways that people go, why are you doing that? And you know what's true is you won't learn. How many of you have ever tried to teach a fearful child that things are fun? You know what I'm talking about? So we had one of each in our house. We had one that wasn't afraid of anything. And then we had one that looked at things and was very cautious and very fearful. And I remember with both of them, it was really funny because the one who was more fearful and cautious, we would say, no, this is going to be really fun. This is going to be fun. This is going to be great. There's a great picture that we have in our house, and it's us on Splash Mountain. And Tyler is in there, and he's got his hands up. He's doing this. Or he's doing, what's the other one, this, or he's doing something with his hands, and he's got this huge, just like grin from ear to ear. He's just loving it. And Eric is right behind him. It was so good a picture of their personalities that we had to buy the picture and put it up. And then behind them is a random guy. We don't even remember being in our boat. We don't know how he got there. But the thing that's great is that that's how it was through their life. And you know what's interesting? It was so hard to get the fearful one to open up. Like, it doesn't matter how many good experiences happened. You'll be like, hey, you remember last time I told you to try this? Yeah. You remember how you liked it when you finally tried it? Yeah. You want to try this one? No. And then our son Tyler broke his front teeth out 4 times. Why? Because the first 3 didn't teach him anything. Right? That's the way that it works, right? Because whatever's inside of you, you don't see the real world, you only see what's inside of you. This lack of vision actually leads us into captivity, bondage, and slavery. Because here's the thing, if you're not dealing with the real world, you can't make good decisions that come out with fruitful outcomes. If you're fearful, you're going to be a captive to your fear. You're going to miss out on so many great things in life. You're never going to be able to enjoy the things as they're happening because you're constantly going to be worried about, well, what if this happens? What if that happens? I remember one of the things that used to really bother me as a parent is we would go on family vacations and we had cars that weren't the most reliable things ever, unlike now when our truck broke down yesterday. But we didn't have the most reliable vehicles ever. And so a lot of times on vacation, I wouldn't be having the fun that I could have because I was always thinking, well, I hope our car makes it. I hope our car makes it. I hope our car makes it. Have you guys ever been there? It can ruin the time that you're having, and so you become a captive to that. But the other thing, though, is that let's say you have a ton of pride in your life, or you have a ton of something else, you have a ton of anger, you have a whatever, you will become a captive to that. If you have a whole bunch of anger inside of you, then everybody's out to get you. Everybody's doing it on purpose. There's no simple mistakes. There's no anything like that. You become a captive to that. See, when you're spiritually blind, you will only see yourself, your fears, your desires, your values, your pride, your anger, your lust, whatever it is. And you will think that everything revolves around whatever that thing is that's inside of you, and it will cut you off from the world, and it will cut you off from other people. You see, when you become spiritually blind, one of the biggest problems is that you will be alone. Because you won't be dealing with that other person. You're going to be dealing with whatever the sin is in your life that colors that person in a completely different way, to the point where you're not even seeing them at all. In Matthew chapter 8, verses 11 through 12, Jesus is talking to the religious leaders. And he's talking about how even though Israel has gotten this great revelation from God, and that God has been so good to them and revealed so much and has this great plan for their salvation and their future, he's saying that they're going to miss out on all of that. Matthew chapter 8, verse 11 and 12, it says, I tell you, many will come from east and west and recline at the table with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven, while the sons of the kingdom will be thrown into the outer darkness. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. You see, what happens is that ultimately your spiritual blindness will lead you to be completely and utterly alone. The world will be darkness to you because you won't be able to see any of it. Already in your life, that spiritual blindness is turning others into obstacles or opportunities instead of dealing with them as real people. And eventually you will see your God the same way, and then everything will be lost. Well, what's the cure? Because we need to not leave us in that dark place. What's the cure for vision? Now, interestingly, Elisha, he doesn't say, hey, let me explain something to you. He doesn't go to a servant and say, hey, look, I know you see this great army, but let me explain how this works. Why doesn't he do that? Well, he doesn't do that because it's deeper than that. Right? Just like when you're dealing with a kid who's maybe fearful, and so they see the world in a fearful way. Have you ever tried to just explain to them the situation? Right? You say, now here's the thing, right? We were at California Adventure with the boys, and I remember sitting down and saying, here's the thing. This ride is very safe. Engineers have designed this ride, and thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of people have ridden it, and only a few of them got hurt. Now, they sued Disneyland, but Disneyland's very good at winning lawsuits, and so they probably didn't win, but it's unlikely that you're going to have that problem. Actually, that you will find that that's ineffective. You can't explain this problem with vision, you can't explain that out of someone. If they're given over to their fear, it doesn't matter how much you explain. If they're given over to their pride, it doesn't matter how many people tell them. Like, if you've ever read stories about how, communism worked or how the Nazi regime worked, what happens when people tell the leader what they don't want to hear? Those people are disappeared. You can't explain somebody into spiritual vision. And so what's interesting is Elisha doesn't try to do that. What does he do? In verse 17 it says, Elisha prayed and said, "O Lord, please open his eyes that he may see." It's actually what happens is God is the one who gives spiritual vision. God gives spiritual vision. Spiritual vision is difficult because we don't have the resources within us to deal with it. The reason that when we have a lack of spiritual vision, when we're spiritually blind, the reason that we see the world the way it is because that's what's in us. And so trying to get us to solve the problem doesn't work because we're the source of the problem. And the interesting thing is we don't even really want to solve the problem. We see the world the way we do because that's the way we want to see it. There's a spiritual stubbornness, a lack of courage, and most of all, a lack of faith that brings us to the point of our spiritual blindness. And taking our eyes off ourselves and trusting God is something that seems to be beyond us. What's interesting is that Peter is a good example of this. You guys remember that Peter's an interesting guy in the Bible because he's always kind of going to extremes. And there was that time that there was a storm and they're in the boat and Jesus is seen walking across the water and Peter says to Jesus, if it's you, Jesus, command me and I'll get out of the boat, which doesn't make any sense to me. I don't know how that's how you discern that that's Jesus's, but anyway, that made sense to him, and so that's what he says. And so Jesus said, "Okay, come out of the boat." At that point, I'd think, well, maybe this isn't Jesus. But that's not what Peter thinks. He gets out of the boat. And remember that he's walking towards Jesus, and then it says that when he saw the wind and the waves, he started to sink. What happens is he takes his eyes off of Christ, and he puts his eyes on the wind and the waves. And really what spiritually we're talking about is he gives up his faith in Christ that he had a moment ago, and he puts his faith in the wind and the waves. He says, this is the thing that's operable here in my future and in my life. It's not Jesus, it's the physical world around me. And the thing is, we do that all the time. We think that our future has to do with the physical world around us. But over and over again, what we find is that that's not the case. You know, I find it interesting that here Elisha is surrounded by these chariots. And I can't help but think that spiritually speaking, what is Elisha surrounded by? Elisha's surrounded by God manifesting himself in these things. And there might be this great supernatural element to this that is kind of ineffable. But I think that we can at the very least explain this in a few ways. That some things that appear physically to be very strong are spiritually very weak, and some things that appear to be spiritually very weak or physically very weak are spiritually very, very strong. How many armies could count tanks upon the thousands and airplanes upon the thousands? But in reality, those are just tools that rely on human beings to operate. And when those human beings have no virtues, they don't maintain the equipment. They don't practice what they're supposed to practice. They don't have any motivation to go forward. They don't have anything but fear. They don't have anything but self-preservation. They don't have anything for which they will risk themselves or die. How many times have these giant armies been humbled by a few people who had the Spirit with them? It happens over and over again throughout history. You see, the cure for vision does not really come from within ourselves. Later, Peter is asked a question. First, he's asked, "Who do people say that I am?" And he says, well, some people say this, some people say that. But in Matthew chapter 16, starting in verse 15, Jesus says, "But who do you say that I am?" And Simon Peter replied, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And Jesus answered him, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven." You see, it's God who cures spiritual blindness. In fact, Christ cures our spiritual blindness by revealing to us who He is, and He has done so throughout the Scripture. And the question really is to us, who do you say Jesus is? Because when you answer that question, that becomes the entry point to having the scales fall from your eyes. That becomes the instigator, it becomes the beginning, it becomes that point at which you start seeing physical reality in a different way. When you say that this guy who appears to be, for all the world, a carpenter that lived thousands of years ago is actually the Son of God who died for my sins, then you start seeing things differently. And in fact, you can't see the world the way that it actually exists, the way that God actually made it, until you see Jesus as the Christ. Because you will not understand the love that God has for you. You will not understand the love that God has for the people around you. You will not understand the very basics of the spiritual realm and the spiritual world until you start to understand that Jesus Christ is the Son of God and that He died for you. Let me give you one example of that. There's a story in the Scripture where Jesus cures a blind man. And this man was born blind, and so the question is, well, who sinned, him or his parents? Because generally speaking, what they believed is that, when bad things happen to you, it happened because you sinned. But the problem is with somebody born blind, it's hard to imagine what kind of sin could have been engaged in the womb. Theologians will discuss things like that for years and years. I mean, they'll go to conferences, they'll write papers, they'll do all kinds of things. But the thing is, it's still hard to grapple with that. And so some people said, no. So it's not that person who sinned, it's their parents. And so this was the big theological debate of Jesus' day is, well, when a guy's born blind, who sinned, him or his parents? We argue about this endlessly, they told Jesus. And Jesus says something interesting. He says neither. He said this happened so that the power of God, the glory of God, could be displayed in his life. You see, the point here is incredibly important. That if you accept that Jesus is the Christ and that he loved you enough to die for you, it changes the way everything else in your life looks, including all the things in your life that you think are things that are so terrible and so bad that have happened to you. You might say, God must hate me because of X, Y, or Z. God must hate me because I was born different. God must hate me because I was born slow-witted. God must hate me because I was born looking like me. God must hate me because, and you can go on and on and on and on. And yet, if you accept that Jesus Christ is the Son of God and that he died for your sins, you have to answer all those other questions differently. You have to open your eyes to the spiritual truth that God allowed you to be born the way that you are so that his power and his glory can be displayed in your life. That means that everything in your life starts to look different. So what's the cure? Well, the cure comes from God. In Romans chapter 1, verse 19 through 21, it talks about the wrath of God being poured out against mankind. In verse 19 it says, "For what can be known about God is plain to them because God has shown it to them." So God showed them the truth about who he is, but all of us, every single one of us, decided to ignore that truth. We decided to ignore the truth about God. It says in verse 24, his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made, so they are without excuse. For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became fueled in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Do you want to cooperate with God in your healing? Because here's the interesting thing. The man who was born blind, Jesus healed him. The healing comes from Jesus. But he said to the man, "Go and wash." And so the man, in faith, he went and washed, and then he was healed. You see, I'm not going to tell you that you can heal your own spiritual blindness. You can't. But I am telling you that you can cooperate with God healing your spiritual blindness. And you want to know how to do that? Worship him and give thanks to him. Worship him and give thanks to him. You got something hard going on in your life? Worship him and give thanks to him. You got some disappointments in your history? Worship him and give thanks to him. The only way to start seeing your life and start seeing the rest of the world the way that God actually created, the way that it actually exists, is to start worshiping God and giving thanks to him. Because God has created you in love, and God has redeemed you in love. Now, does that mean that every single thing in your life God did because he loved you? No, some of those things you did. In fact, there's a lot of those things that you did, but you won't start getting a handle on those things until you start worshiping him and giving him thanks. And when you start worshiping him and giving him thanks, you know what's going to happen? The first thing that's going to happen is your eyes are going to be opened up to a whole lot more stuff that you did that you shouldn't have done. But then you're going to start to see how God can redeem those things. That just because you sinned, that doesn't mean that it's the end. How just because you screwed up, it doesn't mean that your life is over, and it doesn't mean that things are irreconcilable, and it doesn't mean that you've ruined everything. What it means is that God's mercy has an opportunity to shine. Does that mean we go out and sin more? No. But it means that when we do sin, we have confidence in the God who has forgiven us. That we have confidence in the God who has forgiven us and the God who can redeem all things. So what's finally the effect? Oh, man, out of time again. What's the effect of vision? I know we do this every week. I'm so sorry. What's the effect of having vision? Well, you're going to be, first of all, effective in your thinking. Thinking. So Romans chapter 1, we just read it, verse 21. It says, "For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened." So the first thing that's going to happen is your thinking is going to become effective. You're going to start dealing with the way things actually are, and your thinking will actually be effective. When you're not looking at everything in the world according to what's inside of you, the fear, the pride, whatever, all of a sudden, when you start dealing with the world the way it is, people are going to be, wow, that's smart. Like you did something really smart there. Maybe it's the first time you've heard it, but it will start happening. The second thing is your heart will no longer be darkened. You know what's? You're going to start seeing the world in a different way, and the darkness from your heart will be lifted. What a great thing. Instead of seeing the world as this terrible place where just everything's awful, you'll start seeing the glory and the beauty that God's made for the world. But there's more to it even than that. You're going to share in the riches that Christ has for you. In Ephesians chapter 1, verse 17 and 18, it says, and this is a prayer that Paul's praying, it says, "That the God of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of glory, may give you the spirit of wisdom and revelation and the knowledge of him, having the eyes of your hearts enlightened, having your spiritual eyes opened, that you may know what is the hope to which he has called you, what are the riches of his glorious inheritance in the saints." You know what? The reality of the situation is, riches are not physical, they're spiritual. It doesn't matter what kind of riches you're talking about. They're spiritual and they're not physical. And so when your eyes get opened, all of a sudden you will start to see the riches that God has given you in your life. You will start to see the value of the things that God has placed in front of you. Things that you thought were a problem, things that you thought weren't worth anything, things that you thought were nothing but difficulty. All of a sudden you will start to see that there is much more value in your life than you ever thought there was. How do we apply what we've learned? Believe in God's glory. Here's the thing. You can't experience the riches of Christ without belief that what you count as loss, God means for gain. There are so many things in your life that you will say, this isn't worth anything, this isn't worth anything, this isn't worth anything. And maybe you even say, I'm not worth anything. But really, if you don't ever see the glory of God, if you don't have confidence, if you don't have faith in the glory of God, your eyes will never be open to what's really around you and what's really exists. You will just continue to see what's inside of you. Next, you need to belong to him through the covenant. You need to understand that you and Christ are united. So any of the glory that Christ experienced, you're united to him. You know why you have such a great inheritance? Because Christ does. Do you understand how amazing that is? That your relationship to God is based on his relationship to his Son. That you have been invited into what happens within the Trinity, the glory between the Father and the Son. You've been invited into that relationship. And once you start to understand that, man, your eyes will get so big. And to finally become glorious by being transformed to his goal of glory for you. God is shaping you to be glorious. You need to see that the sacrifice is worth it. You need to see the riches that God has for you and understand that the sacrifice that you make in pursuing that is worth it. Because if you don't see that, you'll never start making that sacrifice. God has so much for us. We should not miss it.
Thanks for joining our worship service today. Please follow us on our Facebook page where you can let us know about any needs or prayer requests you may have and keep up with the latest church news and events. You can also check out all of our past lessons and other videos by visiting our YouTube channel. At First Christian, we strive to be the presence of Christ in the world by helping others to believe in God's love for them, to belong to this church, and to become like Christ in their lives. If you would like to support us in our ministry, you may do so by giving online through our website at www.fcct.org or by mailing checks to the church. Have a great week.